The miter saw is one of those tools that's hard to live without in the shop or on the job site. So I'm going to show you how it works and how to use it. If you're into woodworking, consider subscribing. Check the description for a free download. They'll show you how just a couple of tools and a temporary workspace are enough to create hundreds of great projects. What the miter saw does the best is crosscuts. So that means you've got grain that runs this way on a board and you're cutting across the grain. The miter in miter saw is that it cuts miter angles. So it's got this tape here with different angles on it and a pointer here, and assuming these are lined up, and we'll talk about aligning later, you can spin this miter saw both ways and line it up on a particular angled miter cut. Since this saw is a compound miter saw, it also tilts to cut bevels. So we've got a tape here with an indicator, and assuming these are lined up and tuned up, the saw will tilt from 0 to 45 before it stops. So with your board in place, you can cut a 45-degree bevel, which is the same as cutting a miter if you were to stand the board up on its edge. So we would move it to 45, cut a 45 like that. That's the same as cutting a bevel. So a compound cut would be if I set this to a miter angle and then also set it to a bevel angle. This is usually for crown molding. Cut a miter and a bevel at the same time. That is a compound miter cut. The way the miter saw works in this way is it has this big spring here, and as you pull it down straight, the spring brings it back up. So this is a 10-inch blade. You can buy miter saws that fit a 12-inch blade. You can buy them that fit a 7¼ blade. The difference is the clearance from this point, the middle, to the bottom of the blade. So with a 12-inch blade, you can cut thicker pieces than with this 10-inch blade, which can cut thicker than the 7¼ blade. So almost every miter saw has some way to catch the dust, sawdust coming off of the blade. This one has a chute that shoots the sawdust up in the chute and it's collected in the bag, but this doesn't work very well. You could take that off and stick the hose from a wet dry vac in there. That works a little bit better. The problem with this saw and most saws in my experience is that when you're cutting, the sawdust, some goes up this chute, but most of it goes behind or underneath the chute. So this miter saw also has a clamp, which you can put on either side. When you put a piece of stock in here, you're able to lower this and keep it in place while you make a cut. And then most saws have extension wings like this that allow you to extend your holding capacity. If I have a long board, I can extend the wings and it will support that board. When I'm swiveling this to different mitered angles, you'll see that there is a handle, and this handle is essentially a screw that will loosen and tighten. So when I tighten this up, that locks the saw in place. If you're making a picture frame and you're trying to be really precise, you have to account for all the play in the miter saw. So I could move it all the way about ½ degree and tighten it down. That is much different than if I moved it this way and tightened it down. And it's probably best to line up for a picture frame cut, a 45, measure it, test it, get it where you want it, and don't touch it until you make all of your cuts, and do that every time that you do a project. As you're swiveling this miter saw, it's got detents in really common angles that you might find yourself turning this to. So if I go to 45, you can feel that lock in at 45. So you'll notice, even though I've got this locked in to just do a chopping motion, that it looks like it has much more capacity this way. It's because if I loosen this up, this is a sliding compound miter saw, I then can slide all the way the length of these rails and cut a much wider board. Really, it comes down to no matter what the limit of your cutting capacity width is, there's just gonna be boards that you have to cut with the circular saw. So if I wanted to cut 6-inch pieces and I wanted them all to be the same and all to be consistent, then I would clamp a little stop block, and that way you can just come in, push your board up to the stop block, make a cut, remove that piece, push the next piece up the stop block and make repeatable cuts like that very quickly. You have to be more careful when you make a cut like this because with the stop block, you're trapping that piece in there and you're more likely to get kicked back. So I would suggest making your cut, and then before you raise it back up, release the trigger, keep it down, move this piece out of the way, let the blade stop, and then you can raise it back up. Now that we've talked about how the miter saw works, let's talk about safety. But you've already seen how the blade guard covers the blade, and even as you chop, it comes up just enough to allow for the cut, but to still cover the blade and protect you from the blade. You also want to be very careful about cutting pieces that are too short. If you can see, the stock fence that comes with this miter saw does not have much support for something that's this short. Do not make a cut like this. What I would suggest, and we're going to talk about this in an upcoming video when I talk about miter saw modifications, is install a sacrificial fence, which these saws are made to. You're able to screw from the back and attach a fence such as this. So once you cut down through that the first time, you'll have one line that is the kerf or the width of the saw, and so you've got essentially a zero clearance fence to which when you put that up against there, it's supporting the entire piece. Now you still don't want to put your hand on it, so I would suggest using a push stick such as this. That way you've got a lot of support up against the fence, and you've got a push stick that you're giving that firm pressure backwards, firm even pressure that even after you cut this in half, you're not going to push it and it's not going to rack and catch the blade and be shot off. Anytime you begin a cut with a miter saw, make sure the blade is nowhere near the workpiece. Go ahead and keep it quite a bit of a distance away, pull the trigger, get the blade started and spinning, and then bring it down to make the cut. But don't ever cross your arms when you're making a cut. Don't ever use your left hand to hold the right side of a piece as you bring the blade down. You never want your arm to cross this blade insert when you're making a cut. A lot of it is just common sense. If you think through the full motion of your cut, most of the time that's going to prevent injury. When you're making a cut with a miter saw, you want to make sure your workpiece is firmly pushed up against the fence, and your hand is going to be to steady the piece, keep it flat, and also keep the pressure up against the fence at all times. Place your hand on the handle, and depending on what kind of miter saw it is, it could have a vertical handle like this. This one is a horizontal handle. I've got a thumb trigger here that unlocks the actual power trigger. I'm going to get the saw blade turning, let it come up to speed, and then I'm going to bring it down. The way I like to cut with a miter saw is to first make a scoring cut. The scoring cut is a very shallow cut, the length of the board. You're not trying to make a heavy, deep cut, so you're much less likely to get tear out when you're just doing a scoring cut. When you've measured a length of a workpiece that you want to keep, and you're going to cut it with the miter saw, you got to take into account that this blade has a kerf or a width. It's not just separating two sides of the board, it's also taking away about 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, depending on what kind of blade you have. If I measure the length and say I want to keep this side, I'll put a little X on this side, knowing that I'm cutting away this, but I need to keep all of this from the line over. You put that tooth right on the cutaway side that's touching the line on the cutaway side. That way, from this line over, everything's being kept. If you come up here and put this blade evenly right on the middle of the line, you're actually cutting into your side and it's not going to be the length you thought it was. If you just need to take the smallest amount from the end of a board, not even enough to really measure, we can use the fact that these teeth stick out just a little bit further than the face of this blade. If I lower the blade down so that the teeth aren't in the way, push the piece all the way up against the face, hold it in place, raise that back up, and when I come back down, I'm going to take just a sliver off the end of the board. If you're not going to be making super precise cuts with your miter saw, then this next part you may need to do only when you first get your saw, and then like once a year. Now the first thing that we're going to line and tune up is that this blade is in a 90-degree angle with the table. Now this affects the end of our board and it being perfectly flat and 90-degree angle with the bottom, which registers on the table. So to do this, we're gonna bring our blade down and lock it in place. And then I've got this 4-inch tri-square. You just need something that's a 90-degree angle that will fit in here. You need to make sure that you're not touching any of these teeth. Put it flat on the table, push it up against the face of the blade, and make sure that it touches the face of the blade from the bottom all the way to the top. If there's any gaps there, then you're not at a 90-degree angle. So next we're gonna make sure that this blade is at a 90-degree angle with the fence. So I've got my same tri-square, I put it flat on the table, up against the fence, and then I'm gonna have to push mine down a little ways. I don't wanna push up against the teeth, just the face of the blade. And I'm measuring in the same way. I wanna make sure it's flat up against the blade all the way from top to bottom. Look for the next miter saw video where I make some modifications to my saw. Be sure to subscribe if you want to watch another video. Those are on the screen, and we'll see you next time.